Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, award-winning author and acclaimed interviewer Mark Rubinstein. Mark's new suspense novel, Assassin's Lullaby, tells the story of 39-year-old Eli Dagan, a former assassin for the Mossad who now lives a lethal and largely anonymous life in New York City. Haunted by his tragic past and with little hope for the future, he's approached by Anton Gorlov, head of the Odessa Mafia, with a highly complex and sensitive assignment that could help him get out of the business for good or end his life altogether. Mark, who was born in Brooklyn and now resides in Connecticut, holds a degree in business administration and is a trained physician and psychiatrist who has also taught and served as an expert witness. Before turning to fiction, he co-wrote 5 medical self-help books, as well as the non-fiction titles Bedlam's Door and Beyond Bedlam's Door, which draw on his own experiences as a practicing psychiatrist. Mark's novels include the popular Mad Dog trilogy, as well as The Lover's Tango, which won the 2016 Gold Benjamin Franklin Award for Popular Fiction. His 2020 release, The Storytellers, collects 47 masterful interviews he conducted with the world's most acclaimed suspense and thriller authors. Assassin's Lullaby proves that Mark himself belongs to that elite class of storytellers. New York Times bestselling author Reed Farrell Coleman praised, "Jam-packed with crosses, double crosses, murders fair and foul, Assassin's Lullaby is anything but sleep-inducing. An edge-of-your-seat thriller stretching from Israel to Russia to Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. It's a novel both grand in scale and incredibly intimate." Now, Mark Rubinstein reflects on Assassin's Lullaby and reveals why in every life there lurks catastrophe. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. Today, I am delighted to be in conversation with award-winning author Mark Rubinstein, whose new book, Assassin's Lullaby, is available right now. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Hi, John. How are you?
Well, I'm really happy to be in your virtual conversation. It's nice to have face-to-face time with people these days, even if it's just through monitors. I feel like we live through our screens anyway, so this is, kind of the natural evolution of communication. But thrilled to have you here. Love the new book. The title is terrific. I feel like it's very evocative. And I wanted to start by asking you about your new central character. He's Eli Dagan, 39 years old, sort of at a crossroads in life. And so he's a trained assassin. He worked for the Mossad, and now he's living sort of a very anonymous life in New York City. And he is pitched an assignment that can really be a turning point for him and can also potentially be his final assignment as an assassin. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about, what this assignment is and how it does sort of mark that proverbial crossroads moment for him.
Well, I think the essence of almost any novel is for a character to be in conflict. I recall not too long ago, I was in a conversation with, of all people, David Mamet, and he was talking about conflict, not just in his plays, but in plays, dramas, and in novels in a more general sense. And he made the following point, which I think is so illustrative. He said, if Hamlet comes home from school and his father asks him, "How was school today?" and Hamlet says, "Oh, it was great, Dad," it's boring. You don't want to pursue it one line of dialogue further. However, if Hamlet comes home from school and has the notion clearly implanted in his head that his uncle killed his father and that his uncle is sleeping with his mother, well, that's conflict, and that is not boring, and that's what makes a reader or a listener want to go further into the story. So to begin the story with a 39-year-old man who has a tragic and horrific past, who is at a cusp of events in his life whereby he'd like to get out of the life he's been living, as a contract killer for the last 10 years and as a Mossad field agent for the 10 years prior to that. That sets the stage for an intrinsic kind of conflict, because what's going to happen? And the essence, I think, of any thriller novel, of course, is for the reader to say, oh my God, what's going to happen next? So it begins with his meeting Anton Gorlov, a Russian mob boss in Grand Central Terminal. And this Russian mobster has really two assignments for him, or it's one assignment broken down into two components. And the novel sort of, I think, takes off from that point, because concordant with his wanting to get out of the life is the fact that he can do this one last job, which promises him the remuneration of $1 million. Not that he's poor, but this is almost an offer he can't refuse, to paraphrase a famous movie and book. And as I said, the novel takes off from there. So it's at the cusp of life when you're 39 years old. You realize you're not quite physically the way you were 10 years earlier, when you realize you've done things that have been horrible, and horrible things have happened to you, and you have a quest that you must fulfill, which is ultimately to get out of the life and to lead a more peaceful kind of existence.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you too, we spoke a bit, about Gorlov, and it's interesting because he exists sort of in a more communal mafia mobbish setting than Eli, who lives very much a solitary life. But they have some sort of surprising parallels with where they are in life. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that briefly, what they actually share in common.
Well, they share in common a profound sense of loss. Gorlov is a 60-year-old man who was born in Odessa, Ukraine. And I should clarify that the Ukrainians and the Russians in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn really are part of the Bratva, or what's called somewhat incorrectly the Russian mob. But they all are together in this, despite what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia right now, contemporaneously with our talk. And Gorlov has this profound sense of loss, because his parents have both long since died. His mother had a tragic past, which I won't elaborate at this moment. He was married to the love of his life, Nadia, who died of breast cancer. And he too wants to get out of the life and retire and go somewhere, preferably to a warm climate, get out of the life. And he knows that certain loose ends in his Bratva life, in his mob life, have to be cleared up, so that he is not going to be susceptible to being extricated from from where he goes to live the rest of his life. And this is why he's called Eli. Eli, on the other hand, has his own sets of losses. His mother, father, and his pregnant wife were all killed by a suicide bomber on a Jerusalem bus some 20 years earlier, when he was 19 or 20. And so the two men share this equal dose of severe, profound, and traumatic loss in their lives, and both men really want to get out of the lives they've been living for many years. So I also felt that it was important to make Gorlov a character who wasn't just a caricature, who wasn't just a thin cardboard cutout of an evil man. He too has his soft side, his generous side, and that coincides, as we see in real life with people, it coincides with the duality, the Jekyll and Hyde duality of life. We all have parts of ourselves that are less than wonderful and less than generous, and we all have an implicit generosity depending upon circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Sure. Thank you for speaking to that, because those dualities really do, speak to me. And I feel like I pick up on that a lot in books lately. And what I love about this book, you just gave us, sort of the tragic backstory of the characters, and sort of the philosophy, that Eli lives by or believes, is that in every life there lurks catastrophe. And that's sort of become the tagline of the book. And you really get a sense of that. And I was wondering, if we could elaborate, a bit more on that, because it really does give these characters, who may do terrible things at times, in essence, of humanity. And I think that one of the great debates, in fiction is readers and their relationship to characters, and do characters have to be likable, or do they just have to be, believable,
Mhm.
sympathetic, redeemable? And here, you have very complex characters, and we get sort of both points of view, Eli and Gorlov. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, how you create characters that readers aren't necessarily, going to like or feel warm and fuzzy about, but they are going to relate to them and have some level of sympathy, and why that's important for a story like this to have emotional resonance.
Well, I do believe that in every life, to some extent or another, catastrophe does lurk. As we live, all of us as human beings, we are going to encounter loss. The first loss often being the loss of a grandparent, then the loss of a parent, and then the loss of both parents. And these kinds of losses happen in life at various times, and depending on the nature of the life that we're living. In my former life as a psychiatrist, I often dealt almost exclusively with people who had sustained severe and profound losses, either a loss of self-esteem because they lost a job, or the loss of a spouse, or the loss of a loved one in one way or another, even the loss of a boyfriend or girlfriend. So loss and tragedy, and in a sense, catastrophe lurks in every one of our lives. If you can create a character in fiction that mirrors this aspect of life, I think you've got someone that is relatable. And I purposely, actually, I didn't even have to think about it in terms of having a willful purpose in creating a character like Gorlov and one like Eli. Loss is just an intrinsic part of their lives. And of course, there's always the fear of additional loss, namely the loss of one's own life. And in a thriller, in any thriller, there has to be danger that accrues to the protagonist at the hands of the antagonist, in this case, at the hands of Gorlov. And you have these two competing forces, although there's a lot of duplicity going on, and Eli doesn't quite know exactly what awaits him, although he does have an overwhelming sense of danger. And the danger can come from any of a number of different sources. I know I'm going far afield here, but in the context of this novel, there is the loss, there is danger, there is the question of what's going to happen next. Will Eli survive? If he does, how will he survive? What's going to happen next? And then after that, next. And even at the last couple of pages of the novel, there are certain questions that are posed for the reader to contemplate, not in an academic way, but through Eli's eyes and ears and through his senses.
Absolutely. And actually, you may think that you've gone far afield, but you have brought yourself to my next conversational topic, oddly enough, or not. But I did want to ask you, so Eli sort of lives this solitary life, lots of anonymity. He is a trained assassin. And so everything is about, stealth and precision and surveillance. And he knows that. To live like an assassin, he sort of has to live like his life is on the line all the time, because he knows how people would surveil him, how people would potentially attack him. And so everything that he does, there's sort of a forethought. Nothing is really spontaneous. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you get yourself in that headspace so that your character is credible for the entirety of a novel, because you really have to walk that walk with him to make it believable, and you do. And it's sustained, for something like 300 pages, which is not, I wouldn't think an easy thing to do for somebody who's not a trained assassin, which I'm assuming you're not, but you probably couldn't tell me if you were.
Well, I'm not. I must share a slight anecdote with you. At a number of author talks, not for this book, but in previous books, particularly those of the Mad Dog trilogy, which was Mad Dog House, Mad Dog Justice, and Mad Dog Vengeance. On more than one occasion, I've been asked by people in the audience, have you ever killed anyone? Which I take as an extreme compliment vis-a-vis the believability of my violent scenes. And how do I stay in that headset? I guess I do what I think probably every author does. You have to put yourself in some fantasized headset and stay that way while you're banging away on the computer, or as Daniel Silva does, he writes on legal pads and then transfers. He feels there's a better connection from his brain through his fingers with a pen in his hand than using a keyboard. In any event, it's a matter of having a rich fantasy life, or at least a fantasy life rich enough so that while you're writing these scenes, you're actually in this protagonist's head, which is what you want your reader to feel also. I want the reader to feel that he or she is in Eli's shoes, in his head, and experiencing, smelling, seeing, hearing the things that Eli smells, sees, hears, and feels. I'll never forget in a talk with David Morrell, he said that he always criticizes writers who only write through the sensibility of eyesight, what they see. There are 5 senses, and you must use them all in writing through a character, whether it's in the first person or the third person, or it's in the third person past tense or the first person present tense. No matter what style you're using to write, you want the reader to be there in the character's head. So in a very real sense, I have to be in that character's head in order to transform that through my fingers onto the keyboard, onto the screen, and ultimately, I hope, into the reader's mindset. So I don't know how that's done, other than to say that I've always had a rich fantasy life, and I've even wondered if in a sense, I could be an assassin, but I don't think I could.
Right. I think, writing is good for people with rich fantasy lives because you get to live it in a safer way. But that makes me wonder too, in a book like this, you really have to sort of go into some dark places. How do you transition, out of that and back into your normal life? Is that ever difficult, or is it something that you can easily turn on and off?
I think I've become very good at turning it on and off, because when I was working as a psychiatrist, I would, at the end of the day, I would feel as though my brains were scrambled. And my wife would say, I don't know, you're coming home, you're irritable, you're upset. I think you have to learn how to, in medicine, the word is DC, which means discontinue.
Right.
You have to DC these patients' problems when you come home. You have to, leave the problems at the doorstep. And so I became very good at sort of compartmentalizing my mind and not dismissing them, but turning my meter off when I left the office. And it's a skill I think you can develop in time, which I did develop. And I think to some extent that takes place when I'm writing. When I get up from the computer, I have to go, whew, just stifle whatever it was. Sometimes I can't get off. I have to keep typing. There have been times when I end up standing and typing because I'm so engrossed in what I'm writing. And then I get up and I have to cool down. And the best antidote is playing with my dog. I get up and I open the door, and in rushes Jake, the dog, and we tussle around for a little while, and that gets me into a whole different mindset.
Sure. So writers out there who struggle with that, get yourself a pet. It will, help.
Get a pet.
To ease
I'll
back
never
into
forget
it.
this is a little off topic, but I'll never forget one time I was treating a man who was profoundly depressed. He was a man in his 50s, which is a typical time in which men can begin to feel the onset of depression, because they realize that this is as far as they're ever going to go professionally or in business or whatever, and they begin to see the true waning of their physical beings and so forth. It's called the involutional phase of male existence. And I had a man who was very depressed, and it turned out that his wife and his kids weren't really very sympathetic to him. His kids had moved out of the house, and his wife was very involved with her activities, and his dog had died. And this was an immense blow to him. And I couldn't convince him to take some antidepressant medication. So one day I said, well, I'm going to prescribe something for you. And he said, this was in the days before computer prescriptions. And he said, oh, I'm not going to take any medication. I said, okay, I understand. I took out my prescription pad and I began writing. And I ripped off the slip and I handed it to him. And the slip said, get a dog. and he did. And while it didn't take away all the depressive feelings, it did give him something real to focus on. And it made a significant difference in his life at that time. So getting a dog, having a dog, that helps me get through the day after I've finished with a sweaty period of writing.
Sure. Well, there you go. I think sometimes the simplest things have the most profound effect, and there's a great case study for that. So just a few more questions about Assassin's Lullaby, and then we will move into broader territory, if you don't mind.
Sure.
But one of the things I thought I'd ask you about, is the idea of a book like this. It's very much action oriented, but Eli also lives sort of a very rich internal life, and we're in his headspace a lot. And what I love is we get his backstory and the emotional resonance of that without having to have, flashbacks or things like that. He's able to relive it in a very real, in the moment way. And I'm wondering if that is a conscious decision for you, to find that balance between sort of action and intellect and emotion, or if that's something that you have to strive for throughout the sort of revision process, because it comes off really well in a book like this.
Thank you. Well, it's part of the craft of writing, I think. There is what some critics will call information dumps, which you don't want to do. And I can't tell you the number of novels that I've begun reading and tossed aside because by page 5, I already got a 3-page information dump about the backstory of a character. I think it's a studied, willful effort on my part to bring out as much as I can in dribs and drabs over the course of much of the novel, even perhaps the last few pages. People don't spend their lives thinking exclusively about their past travails. It comes up in the context of something you see or hear, or a song you may hear on the radio as you're driving in the car to go to work. And then the next thing you hear is a horn honking, and your consciousness is riveted back to the present and maybe the problems you're having on the job. So this is the way we live our lives, and it's the way I try to write a novel. I think it is, as I said, a studied bit of craft that when I first began writing, I think I fell prey to the usual mistake of doing information dumps. And if you dribble it out bit by bit, and if at the same time you can make it relevant, in other words, Eli sees 2 women coming out of a restaurant at night when he's walking toward a bar, and one woman just strikes him. Anyone who's ever lost a loved one knows that you can have this moment in time when you see somebody who looks exactly like the deceased person, and you just are struck it's maybe for a half second. And that brings back thoughts of his wife, Hannah. Other incident where he sees a woman who looks like her, who has an accent the way she did. So there are certain tricks of the trade by which you bring out the backstory. And in so doing, I think you create a more credible character and one who is more relatable. I think there are very few things that are as boring, except for inane dialogue, as bringing out a 5-page backstory on a character, or going through a list of attributes of some character that the protagonist is meeting. That's another thing when you're describing a peripheral character, let's say a registration clerk at a hotel. You don't have to spend 2 paragraphs describing what that registration clerk is wearing, or the hairstyle, or the look in her eyes, or whatever. A couple of very brief focal points brings the essence of the character to the reader's mind. And I've always thought that it's best to let the reader's imagination fill in all the blanks rather than you providing a a detailed description of every single character. So I don't know if I've really answered your question, but almost every question you asked, John, I can expound for hours.
The true mark of an expert. You can take my babble and turn it into something profound. But no, I mean, I think that's a great perspective. And I think you sort of brought it back to, I believe you'd mentioned David Morrell before, who said that, reading should really be a sensory experience and it shouldn't just be sight, but, smell and all these things. And you're right. In the book, Eli, is seeing things, smelling things, hearing things, and those are sort of what evoke memories within him. And then we, as the reader, learn that along with his reminiscences, and it's very organic and it works really well. And I didn't necessarily think about it like that while I was reading it, but that's what I love about these discussions is I hear you say that and then it clicks in my mind and I'm like, of course, that's sort of how this entire book works is something will trigger that memory and then it's not that information dump that you were talking about because readers like us who read a lot, we can see it coming and we're like, oh no, here it is, 3 pages of exposition, and you just want to tear right through it. But no, that was terrific. And before moving away from this book, I did just want to ask you, you mentioned before that Eli sort of presented with 2 parts of one assignment, and the second part sort of necessitates his involvement with a young woman named Irina. And I'm just wondering if you can speak briefly to what it is that she comes to represent to Eli, and then how also that can sort of be potentially a point of vulnerability for him.
Well, he is vulnerable. He's been living a rather deprived life in many ways. He floats on the periphery of society. He has no attachments. He is something of a spectral, ghostly figure, given the nature of not only his background, but of the way he is earning a living at this time. As you pointed out before, he must be palpably aware of everything going on around him, and as such, he's in a state of constant vigilance, and that really precludes getting close to people. And also, because of the tragedy of his background, he doubts that he could ever find love again. And this woman represents for him, he's given the task of trying to extract from this woman a flash drive, something that may have incriminating evidence on it that could get Gorlov in trouble, so that he could be, in theory, at least extradited from wherever his new haven is going to be once he leaves New York and the United States. So Eli is given this task, which he accepts at first reluctantly, but when he meets Irina, he is struck by not only her beauty, but by a certain soulfulness that she projects. And in that soulfulness and vulnerability, because she's a newly arrived immigrant from Russia, who doesn't really know America yet, and is at least in Eli's view and perspective, as someone who can be taken advantage of, he identifies with her through what she is and what Hannah had been, Hannah, his lost wife. And so she represents for him at least the burgeoning sense that perhaps he can find a new beginning. In fact, at some point, he begins fantasizing that perhaps he can take her with him to some paradise-like place where they can begin new lives together, because he's convinced that once Gorlov gets this flash drive, the Bratva will have no use for her and they will eliminate her. So she becomes, in a sense, an equivalent being along with what Hannah was, because Hannah has been eliminated. Right. So she represents many things for him, but most of all, perhaps a different future, one that can provide at least the opportunity for closeness and intimacy and love. At one point, Eli even thinks to himself, this is what we live for. Right. And I don't want to say any more than that because it could be a spoiler, but it becomes a fulcrum, a turning point in the novel where Eli does meet her and where things then really begin to happen.
Sure, absolutely. So I wasn't going to ask you this, but I am going to ask you this really quickly, just because there are so many fine, points to this book. Are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? Or are you somewhere in between the two, a planter or whatever it is that they call that?
Uh, I'm a plotzer.
A plotzer, that's
A
the word.
plotzer. I don't do outlines. I'm not a plotter in that sense. I'm not really a pantser either. I think that to just go free floating through, I would end up by after 5 or 6 pages not knowing where I'm going to go. To quote Harlan Coben. I can quote these people, by the way, because I did an interview book called The Storytellers, in which I interviewed. Oh, there you go.
There it is.
There you go.
Subtle.
All right. Harlan Coben said, I know where I want to begin and I know where I'm going to end. I have no idea how I'm going to get there. I think that also characterizes much of what my technique is. What I end up doing is I have a basic idea. I think I know I do know the beginning. I think I know the end, although that can change. And what I do is I just write down a series of thoughts. They're not necessarily cohesive, and they aren't time related in the sense of being a narrative plot. And then I see which one of them might begin to fit, and then I start to plug in a little bit. And then, of course, I find that I love the fact that a little while ago you used the term organic, because I find that novel writing, a novel is an organic thing. It grows, changes, and morphs as you go. At least it does for me. For instance, at page 70, I might write something that will no longer fit with what I wrote on page 15. So I have to go back and change page 15, lest it be an alarming kind of incongruity in the character or in the plot. So the novel does change and morph over time. And in a sense, I finally did learn what some people say, that the novel, in a sense, writes itself. That's not true, of course, but it feels that way once you, and I tell you, it really feels that way when you walk past a bookshelf and you see a line of books that you've written and you say, where the hell did that all come from? Could I do that again? And the answer is no. I don't think I could do it again. And that you've drawn stuff up from the depths of your own self, and somehow or other it got to be on the page. And I sometimes have the fantasy that, what if I'm on page 210 of the novel I'm writing right now, okay? Which, by the way, is a sequel to Assassin's Lullaby, although there are 2 books in between. What if some glitch occurred in my computer and it all disappeared on me? Suddenly, oh my God, a technologic nightmare. Could I recreate what I've gotten in these 210 pages? And I say, no, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do this again. And I think intellectually I would say, yes, I could. It would probably be different, but boy, I would hate to even try. So the novel is an organic thing, and you have to go from the depths of your own self into hopefully the depths of other people who are potential readers. And again, I've gone off topic, but I hope I've said something that's worthwhile. I don't know.
No, absolutely. And I love that you would mention that, because I think that sometimes aspiring writers look at more established writers who have sort of a backlist of books, and they think that over time it becomes, maybe easier for the writer and the writer has more confidence. But what you said reminded me of something that Tess Gerritsen wrote about recently. I know that you interviewed her for The Storytellers as well, but she said, in every manuscript, she reaches a point where she wonders, how is this going to get done? How have I ever done it before? And how is it that I'm going to do that again in the future? And if somebody like you or Tess Gerritsen can sort of have those moments of doubt, I think that gives the rest of us a bit more comfort, because, you still make it happen book to book, but that doesn't mean that it becomes easier. That doesn't mean that doubt isn't there. You find ways to move beyond it. But I think that's a source of comfort for people who don't have that same level of experience. So
you're very right. And if I can digress for just a moment again, if there's one common theme amongst all 46 authors and the storytellers, it's that writing never gets easier, that each new novel, it feels as though you're doing it for the first time. And virtually every author I interviewed has doubts, as to whether this book is any good, whether I can finish this book. And it's just a recurrent theme, and it doesn't matter whether it's Harlan Coben or it's the author of the V.I. Warshawski books, Sarah Paretsky. It doesn't matter who the author is. It's just amazing. Ian Rankin said, you'd think that writing novels gets easier as you go. It's sort of like, if you're a car mechanic, you fix one engine, you can fix another, and then another, and after a while, you can do it with your eyes closed. But no, each new novel is its own challenge and its own dreadful kind of journey that you have to take. And there is a mixture. Every morning when I sit down at the computer, there's a mixture of anticipation on a positive basis and a sense of dread when I'm looking at a blank screen, because I have to begin a new chapter. Lately, I've begun, by the way, I've begun limiting myself to one chapter a day, because I don't feel that I have the strength, the inner strength, to go to the next chapter. I have to fortify myself by a day with my dog and my wife and have a couple of good meals and have a night's sleep before I could go on to the next chapter. I'm having more trouble with this novel now than I've ever had, even with my first novel. And it's not terribly unusual. It's almost par for the course.
Sure. And there's something to be said for, recognizing that you do need that time and space, away from it. And I guess, I was going to ask you about the storytellers, but I'm just going to ask you right now, because we've mentioned it a few times now. It's, it's a terrific compendium. I mean, it really is a who's who of your favorite mystery, suspense, thriller authors. If you can think of a name, it's probably in this book. And it's great to listen to on audio too, because, if you like to walk or exercise, it's broken down interview by interview. So there's nice segmented pieces, but it's very insightful. And I wanted to ask you, interviewing really is a skill if you're good at it, because you don't want to be entirely redundant. There are things that, people want to know about, but then you want to be a bit more original too. So can you talk about the skill of interviewing, how you plan for an interview, and then, as the interview's in progress, how you sort of conduct that and go with the flow so that it's worthwhile, not only for you and the author, but also for who is eventually going to be your audience or readership?
Well, the first thing that I think the first rule of interviewing any author is to read the book that was written just prior to the interview, the latest book. I can't tell you how many interviews how many times I've been interviewed, whether it's on cable TV or on the radio or whatever, where it's so apparent within about 7 milliseconds that the interviewer has not read the book and is asking the most generic questions imaginable. And it's sort of off-putting, and it makes you feel as though the interview is really not worthwhile. That doesn't pertain to you. It's so obvious that you've read both The Storytellers and Assassin's Lullaby. In any event, after having read the novel and then going online and reading about the author himself or herself, getting a sense of the oeuvre of that author, of his or her life, and there's an amazing amount always available either on Wikipedia or wherever about the author, and getting some semblance of an idea about whatever thematic infrastructure seems to preoccupy. For instance, with Harlan Coben, it's not always, but it's very often about a missing person.
Right.
And so I labeled his chapter, Harlan Coben, the master of the missing person. Don Winslow, master of Shakespeare and all things, I forget, but because he at one point was a director of Shakespearean plays, and some of his dialogue reads almost Shakespearean in quality. So I think the basic formulation rule is you got to know a little bit about the author, and you got to know a bit about his or her writing, and you go from there. And the most free-flowing interview I conducted in the book was with David Mamet, who was a reluctant interviewee, but he did acknowledge at some point in the interview that as reluctant as he wasn't doing very well with me, because I was persistent and yet gentle, because I had the sense he was a very volatile guy, and I didn't want to, I didn't want the interview to go down the tubes. And I got a lot out of him. and about art, about playwriting, about plays versus novels versus screenplays, and yet I had to be a little bit of a tough guy with him. I had to not yield to his ego, which was a very, very powerful influence on the we had to go where he wanted to go.
Right.
I even had him commenting about actors, Al Pacino and Uma Thurman, and what it was just that he was a very interesting, very provocative, very difficult guy to interview. And at the end of that, I went, whew, you know.
I got that sense reading that interview. But no, it's such a fascinating read. And especially, for somebody like me, I've always been intrigued by storytellers and I so admire, what you're able to do. But then to see these interviews done by such a skilled person in such a deft way, not only do I have the joy of reading the author's response, but the insights that go into your questions and what you're able to bring out of authors, because, I've probably read a million, interviews with somebody like Tess Gerritsen or Lisa Gardner, and you will find things in your book, The Storytellers, that they share that you're not going to find, anywhere else. So it sort of makes you want to up your game as an interviewer. So this is sort of like a master class in interviewing, in addition to authors sharing sort of the secrets of their trade. So hats off to you on that, because I find that there's a bounty of gifts in this book.
Thank you so much.
Sure. And so, okay, I'm going to steal one of your questions. I have to ask you, because something that you ask everybody in this book, which is fun, it's fascinating, you know exactly where I'm going with this, but you ask everybody, you're invited to a dinner party and you can invite any 5 people, living or dead, from any walks of life to join you. Who would they be? So who would your 5 people be?
I've been asked this question since the Storytellers came out. I've been asked this question at library talks and so forth. And I must confess that I still don't have a hard and fast answer. Dennis Lehane was a very interesting guy. I'd love to have him there. He's a hard-boiled kind of a character, as hard-boiled as some of his novels are. I got the feeling from him he's a no-nonsense guy. He doesn't truck in niceties. I would love to have the availability to be able to speak with Philip Roth. I so admire his writing, not everything he wrote, but when I think about American Pastoral and The Plot Against America, these books were just such beautiful pieces of literature. And I'd love to get his take on feminism and writing in general. Other people who I'd love to, Edgar Allan Poe is somebody, although he'd probably be drinking himself under the table. Edgar Allan Poe was a profound influence on me as a youngster of 14, 15, 16. I loved his stories. I'm blocking her name now. One of the founders of the feminist movement who could argue so beautifully with Philip Roth, although I'm not sure they would have much to argue about. What's her name? She was a Playboy bunny for a while.
Oh, I'm going to be of no help to you here.
I don't know why I'm blocking her name. Maybe it's my own sexism. I'm blocking her out. And I have to come up with a 5th person. I'm not even sure who it would be. Let me get back to you on that. As I said, I don't have any hard and fast cast of characters picked out. When I was interviewing Ace Atkins, he said that the 5th person for him would be Raquel Welch. So I said, well, what would you all be talking about? He said, well, we'd be talking about Raquel Welch.
Of course. Yes, she's sitting at the table. What else is there to talk about? But it's funny because it is a difficult question. It's a fun question, but I've even started breaking it down into my mind between the living and the dead just to try to narrow it down to 5. And then, okay, is this going to be writerly people or just, people from my life who I would like to see again? It is a terribly difficult question and I can't narrow it down, even segmenting it into different groups. So, you get a pass on number 5. So let me just, if you don't mind, a couple more questions for you. Sure. I could obviously talk to you all day, but we both have lives to get back to. But I did want to ask you, you mentioned briefly your background as a psychiatrist. You were also trained as a physician. And this question, of course, will do justice to none of that, but I would assume that that's a really rich background to have, because not only do you understand, the psychology of crime and criminals and, victims and victimization, but the physicality of that world too. So I'm wondering if you can speak in general terms as to how that helps to inform your fiction and how you want to portray these real life issues through that lens.
Well, my general rule, to go from the general perhaps to the specific, is, as I said before, my meter is off in terms of psychiatry, socially, in every single way. And especially, I think, when I'm writing fiction, I guess the only real rule that I try to apply is that I want my characters to be complex people who are really as complex, if I can make them that way, as people are in real life. And I know from having lived my life and also from having treated so many people and interviewed so many people, particularly in my forensic psychiatry activities years ago, I know how complicated people can be and how there's more than a duality. There's a multiplicity of personas that we can adopt. We're different when we're talking to a cop on the beat in the street asking for directions than we are talking to a wife, than we are talking to a friend, be that friend a man or a woman. It's just a different kind of posture that we assume. So we're capable of being different, not different people, but having different facets of our own complex personalities emerge. And I try and, if I can, try and make that emerge in my fictional characters. I'm not so sure that I specifically rely on my psychiatric training, which really, in my view, is sort of dull in comparison to the way the characters really formulate themselves and come across on the page or in real life, the way people come across. Again, I don't know if I've answered your question, but people have asked me, does your psychiatric background help you in writing fiction? I would say, not really. I think what I depend on most of all is the capacity for empathy and for understanding in some empathic way what people deal with, how they think, how they feel, and how they behave, and what motivates them. And I don't think you can be trained to feel and understand that. I think it comes through just as a part of your own persona, if it's there. I mean, someone like Donald Trump doesn't have that,
Right. I was going to say, if we could teach empathy, we'd be in a much better place, I think.
Yeah, there are people who have it and there are people who don't. And I have no compunction about saying Donald Trump doesn't have it. And if that turns off some potential readers, so be it. What can I do?
There you go. Fair enough. So quick follow-up, you have written nonfiction as well, both collaborative works and sort of case studies based on your own experiences. And now you do fiction too. So I'm wondering, not necessarily if you have a preference between the two, but do you find, that fiction may be sort of a more palatable lens through which to look at real world issues? Because even though they are very topical and true, there's sort of that, level of protection from it being real people, real circumstances. What draws you to fiction, and what do you get out of that you don't necessarily get out of the nonfiction books that you've done?
Well, the fiction is so much richer, and I can, in a pretend way, I can, through a different character's eyes, I can make certain critical statements about people on their cell phones constantly, or people taking pictures of their food in restaurants, and I can do that through a character's eyes, and I'm one step removed from that character, from making a direct criticism. Ian Rankin feels the same way, and he's a pretty good person to emulate in that regard. He feels that he makes many comments about society at large through John Rebus, and I try not to politicize my fiction, but occasionally I do find certain social criticisms seeping in. Especially when I have a character going through Grand Central Station and there's someone holding up a selfie, taking a selfie or whatever, and you can criticize the narcissism of certain people or whatever. I do prefer fiction over nonfiction, although I will say this: nonfiction is so easy for me. There was a time when my agent was hooking me up with various medical specialists, and I was basically writing the books for them, whether it was about breast cancer or heart disease or whatever, because these diseases have enormous psychologic components to them, as does the diagnosis, the treatment, and the sequelae. So I always found that writing the nonfiction was just very easy, just flows like water, just coming down a waterfall. Whereas fiction is much harder. I really have to struggle with it and revise and revise like crazy, and it can make me tear my hair out. But on the other hand, it's so much more rewarding, and allows me so much more "quote unquote" poetic license to make comments about people and society, and be critical in a non-overly judgmental way. So I much prefer fiction.
Sure, I love that. And I feel like fiction too, there can be too many choices. Like, I'm good, give me one or two or three choices and maybe I'll be able to choose. But if I have a complete blank canvas, it's almost an overwhelming choice, where to take the story, what to do, because it sort of is an endless thing. So interesting point there. All right, just a few more questions. So at the end of, Assassin's Lullaby, you talk about how there's this perception that writing, is a very solitary endeavor, and it is, until it isn't. And then you reach a point, where you have readers and editors and other people chiming in on your work. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about quickly, the benefits of having that support network, not only in terms of, pragmatism with the writing itself, but also people who understand what it's like to live the emotional life of a writer, because it is a very distinct thing. So what does that group of people afford you? And let me ask you too, specifically about your wife, because I know that she seems to give really, really great feedback. And people say, never have your wife or your family or your closest friends read your books. And I don't think that that's necessarily true, because I think that my wife, is my first reader and my harshest critic, but also my biggest supporter. I think it depends on the person. So if you can tell us about the group at large, and then a bit about, your relationship with your wife and what she brings to the work specifically.
Well, I'll begin with my wife. I think in the arc that you have, in the advanced reader's copy that you have, I may have an acknowledgments, my last statement in the entire book. The last few words before you hit the back cover are something about well, actually, if I can read it,
Please do.
I think it summarizes everything I've said about my wife, or that I want to say about my wife. Bear with me just a second.
Of course.
Most of all, I'm grateful to my wife, Linda. She's not only the CEO of my life and makes everything worthwhile, but is a 5-star grammarian and a top-notch first reader. She remains a fabulous source of creative energy, unyielding support, and most of all, love. The truth is, she's rescued every novel I've ever written. Thanks a million, babe. Then I go on and I thank my 7 dogs that I've had over the course of my life. But my wife has rescued every novel I've ever written. She will go through, I have to print out the hard copy, and she goes through it with a fine-tooth comb, not just for formatting and grammatical errors, of which I'm guilty of making many. But conceptually, she'll say, this is absurd. Nobody would say this. Nobody would do this. This doesn't comport with what happened earlier in the book. You're a moron. And she's right. She's always right. I learned very early on, trust her judgment. She went to Catholic parochial school and knows Latin. She can speak in Latin, and she knows all the roots of all the words, and she corrects everything. So in a more general sense, the feedback you get from editors and from copy editors, by the way, are very, very valuable. They'll point out the simplest thing. Like I once talked about in one novel I was writing, a martini glass, and he says, and the copy editor said, it's not really called a martini glass, it's called a Savoy glass. And named after the Savoy Hotel in London, which is where it was first invented. I said, that's fascinating. And I went and I looked it up, and sure enough, it was called a Savoy glass. And I said, well, if I call it a Savoy glass, nobody will know what I'm referring to. Everybody calls it a martini glass. She said, well, that may be true, but just so you know, it's called a Savoy glass. Little tidbits like that are not only interesting, but can really lend a level of verisimilitude to what you're writing. And then there's conceptual editing and line editing and whatever. The feedback from first and second and third readers, alpha readers, beta readers, gamma readers, whatever they may be, is always helpful. I'm lucky in that I have a couple of friends who really feel free enough with me to be honest and be lethally honest, who will tell me, this stinks. This is terrible. Why do you have him doing this, that, and the other thing? This would never work. And I've told them, don't soft soap me. Don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Tell me what any critical reader would tell me, and they do. And I lick my wounds, and then I go ahead and I go and I correct what they pointed out is wrong. So it's terribly valuable. It really is.
And if they don't tell you, readers will, so it's probably better to hear it from them first.
Well, writing is a solitary way of living if you're writing in a vacuum, but if you're leaning on and depending upon other people for some feedback, and as I said in the acknowledgments in Assassin's Lullaby, that in a sense I have to thank the teachers I had, particularly those when I was a resident in psychiatry, who taught me how to look at and examine human behavior. Certain writers whom I've emulated and who I admire, and really so many people in my life who have given me feedback, both positive and negative, and have really, through a final common pathway, have emerged on the page, I think. And that's what's made me a better writer than I otherwise would have been.
Sure. All right, so winding down in earnest now, I do have to ask you this because I asked pretty much everybody, and I'm sure you saw it coming from the start of this conversation, because you're a writer, so I'm going to ask you. But, for people out there looking for some words of guidance, specifically either to a writing life or a creative life more generally, what do you think is the best advice that you were ever given, and then the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself throughout the process of actually doing the work?
The best advice that I've ever been given, and it's been given to me in many different ways, but the one that strikes me as most relevant and pithy is the advice that's in the Storytellers that Don Winslow gave me personally over lunch, and which is in the book. Writing is a verb before it's a noun. You must write every single day. Don once said to me, the longest I ever spent between novels was 2 days, which is unthinkable to me. I mean, I just don't know how he does it. By the way, he's retired from writing at a relatively early age, at the age of 68, 69. In any event, the advice that's most valuable that I found is you must write consistently every single day, even if it's only for 15 or 20 minutes. You must make it an integral part of your life. The advice I was never given, and which I learned is an element of the writer's life, and I learned it on my own, is that writing is a supremely frustrating and difficult thing, and that if you become a writer and you consider yourself a writer, you must be prepared to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous self-criticism and doubt. Because in the middle of every novel I've ever, as Tess Garrison said, in the middle of every novel, I will tell myself, this is terrible. This is the worst thing I've ever done. And yet somehow it gets done, and it isn't so bad. It may not be world-class literature that'll be studied 50 years from now, but it's not so bad. And it will eventually sit on the shelf, and it will be part of my oeuvre. And there's the only one who will really care about it is me and my wife and my dogs.
Well, there's a truth bomb for you. All right, final question because we just love suspense around here. So I'm wondering if you can leave us with a bit of a teaser as to what comes next. I believe you mentioned that there will be a sequel to Assassin's Lullaby, but it sounds like you have a couple of books coming, before that. If you wouldn't mind just giving us a hint.
Sure. Downfall is coming next. That's published. It's going to be published by Ocean View Press, based in Sarasota, Florida. Um, Downfall is the story of a 34-year-old physician named Rick. I've forgotten his name already.
His name is Rick.
Rick Shepard. It's now sitting with the publisher, and I'll be getting the ARCs soon. Rick is sitting at a luncheonette counter in New York City in Manhattan, and he rushes his lunch because he has to get back to a booming practice, which is part of the bane of his existence. And he comes to his office is a street level private entrance on 79th Street in Manhattan, a wide both residential and commercial street. And he sees a crowd outside the doorway to the office, and he meanders through the crowd, and behind the police tape he sees that there's a dead body covered by a tarp, and the police are there, and the whole forensic CSI team is there and everything. And his office, he can't get into the office, it's closed, and it's a crime scene. And he goes to the hospital, calls the office. This takes place in 1982, so there are no cell phones.
Right.
He calls the office, and he learns from the receptionist the office is closed. So he goes home, and that evening on the 6 o'clock news, it's the leadoff item on the local news, and a picture of the victim is flashed, and he sees a picture of a guy who looks exactly like him.
Dun, dun, dun.
And it happened in front of his office. And then the novel takes off from there. And talk about having to think, well, all right, that's a great boom, boom beginning, but where do I go from there? And well, you have to read it to find out. It's called Downfall. And they sent me a mock-up of the cover, which says Downfall in broken shards, and there's shards of glass coming out toward the viewer. And I felt that's a great cover, because it does indicate the breakup of an ordinary, predictable, safe life.
Sure. Well, maybe I can have you on again when that book comes out, because it leads itself to a whole other discussion of, all right, you have this great premise, this great hook, and then how do you maintain that for the entirety of a book, which always interests me. So you can just promise me you'll come back.
Oh, I'll come back gladly. You're a great interviewer. I really think yours is the most complete and most penetrating interview that I've ever encountered, and I've never said that before. I guarantee
you were very
that.
kind. That is high praise.
That. And just remember one thing: in every life, there lurks catastrophe.
What a note to end it on. All right, readers, you must go pick them up. You've got Assassin's Lullaby and The Storytellers. This is the reading you need in your life this summer. Mark Rubinstein, you are the master. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.